Unfortunately, when it comes to conflicts and crises, 2024 was a pretty eventful year. And while on this channel we, hopefully quite understandably, focus mostly on Russia, Ukraine and great power competition, there are also an array of other conflicts and geopolitical gambits that we touched on, many of which have had a transformative impact on the strategic interests of the actors involved. And so we've seen some who could probably claim to have emerged from 2024 as geopolitical winners, and those whose greatest claims of strategic success is probably that they avoided a Mussolini-style relationship with local lighting infrastructure. And so today, I'm going to look at some of the conflicts other than the war in Ukraine that we looked at in late 2023 and 2024, and try to identify some of the biggest winners, biggest losers, and a few where the most reasonable answer, I think in the true spirit of the 2020s, is just that it's complicated. To go through our strategic awards show of sorts, we'll first start with the basic brief, and then we'll go region by region, covering the Middle East, Korean Peninsula, the Americas, and finally some honourable mentions in Europe and Africa. In the interest of time, we won't be covering actors that regularly get their own episodes, like Russia, Ukraine, the US and China, nor those that are due to get their own detailed coverage in the near to medium term. And we'll keep the focus on topics that we've previously covered, but which really could do with an update. Please note, however, that these ratings are obviously subjective, and just because a country doesn't make it into this episode, doesn't mean it didn't have a very bad or very good 2024. And so now, just before we jump into our first episode of the new year, quick word from a returning sponsor. Well, the new year's here, and you can bet it's going to be an eventful one. And so if you're tracking through the news headlines of 2025, it might sometimes be difficult to know if you're seeing the story from all the angles, or if critical information is being conveniently left out or de-emphasised. Look at the recent coverage, for example, of Ukraine's decision not to renew its gas transit agreement with Russia. Here, some headlines might highlight just how big of an economic and political setback this might be for Russia, while shockingly enough, Russian sources tend to push any suggestion this is bad for Moscow out of the headline, and instead focus on the potential economic impact on the European Union and Ukraine. The tool being used to click between the various headlines here is long-term sponsor Ground News. And what it allows you to do by drawing on more than 50,000 sources around the world is quickly see how stories are being reported, while at the same time also providing extra useful context, like ownership information and factuality ratings based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. It also has a range of other useful features, things like the blind spot feed. And what that more or less attempts to do is surface the kind of stories that might often be underreported in the type of media that you ordinarily consume, helping you stay aware of what others might be seeing and discussing. And in an era that feels increasingly dominated by online echo chambers, that kind of feature might feel like a useful step in the right direction. So if you are interested in potentially adding this tool to your online toolkit in 2025, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on Ground News Vantage Plan, which is the plan I use and actually just renewed for another year. So with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so given this topic is so subjective, here are a couple of ground rules on how I'm going to be going about this kind of analysis. One of the purest ways to analyse strategic success or failure would be to ask whether or not a country accomplished its strategic goals. We'll do a little bit of that, but it can be hard to do in an objective fashion, because a country's strategic objectives can be both secret and subjective. So what I'll do for the most part, surprise surprise, is take more of a defence economics lens, looking at what a country's economic position is and whether it got better or worse over the year, and how both its geopolitical position and military resources shifted with time. Because, for example, purely hypothetically, if a country was to make minor strategic gains at the expense of throwing away decades of accumulated military resources that couldn't be readily replaced, then good old Pyrrhus would probably want a word before we classify that as an unambiguous strategic win. Final caveat, though, is that we are trying to be more illustrative than exhaustive here. So do keep in mind that many of these assessments, to some extent, are going to be in the eye of the beholder. So let's start with a group of nations and non-state actors that arguably didn't have a great year. Namely, the self-described axis of resistance. If you don't recognise the term, it has come up a couple of times in our episodes about Iran, Israel, Syria and the region more generally. But it's a term that's long been used in the media and also by figures in the Iranian government itself to describe both Iran as well as its various proxies and allies across the region. Yes, when rendered in English, it could be argued that calling yourself the axis of just about anything these days probably isn't a great decision from a public relations perspective and sort of jinxes the whole endeavour. But in Persian or Arabic, the term probably doesn't carry quite the same baggage. But for a range of members, who at the start of 2024 included Iran and Syria, Hezbollah, as well as various Iranian supporter groups across the region, the Axis 2024 experience might have felt dangerously close to the original 1944 version. For example, let's start with Hezbollah in Lebanon and their conflict with Israel. Remember, a key part of what we're looking at here is how things changed, the direction of travel, so to speak. And in the years leading up to 2024, international analysts often regarded Hezbollah in very serious terms. In 2018, for example, the CSIS described Hezbollah as the world's most heavily armed non-state actor, and we've previously gone through reports estimating that the organisation was deeply dug into southern Lebanon and had an arsenal even 5+ years ago of more than 130,000 rockets and missiles. That arsenal grew even more formidable in the lead up to 2024 and was described as the organisation's primary deterrent against Israeli military action. If deterrence was part of the goal, though, it appears to have comprehensively failed in 2024, where we saw a rapid, sharp escalation in kinetic actions between Israel and Hezbollah, which included a number of Hezbollah members suddenly discovering in a very first-hand manner that many of the organisation's communication devices had been converted into bombs in what is generally assessed to be an Israeli supply chain attack. The group also lost many senior commanders and leaders to more conventional causes of death, like Israeli airstrikes, including the group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who had led the organisation since 1992. Since we last talked about Hezbollah, they confirmed their new leader, Naim Qassem. Almost immediately after Nasrallah's death, speculation began over who would be selected to lead Hezbollah next. It was widely anticipated that process would lead to the selection and elevation of Nasrallah's cousin, but he was then also killed in an Israeli airstrike, and so we got Qassem. A man who, according to Nicholas Blandford, was, quote, hoping to become Hezbollah's Secretary-General when Moussawi was killed in 1992, end quote, only to then lose that leadership contest to Nasrallah. Roughly 32 years later, and now in his mid-70s, Qassem finally has the job. And from a geopolitical perspective, one of Qassem's most important acts has been to agree a ceasefire deal with Israel. Reportedly, the intention is for this to be a quote-unquote permanent agreement, although based on historical precedent, in this context, permanent might just mean that you can expect the deal will outlast a lettuce, and after that, all bets are off. In terms of content, the deal reinforces a kind of buffer zone. As you can see on the right there, Hezbollah is required to withdraw all of its fighters and infrastructure to positions north of the Litani River. As for the IDF, they have to undertake a phased withdrawal south of the so-called Blue Line. Inside that zone marked in red, there are only meant to be 2 official armed forces active, the United Nations forces of UNIFIL and the official Lebanese military. How much this actually stings Hezbollah probably comes down to how strictly the agreement is enforced. After all, they weren't meant to have positions in this zone to begin with. And figures in the Lebanese government have already publicly voiced their concerns about the ability of their country to actually enforce these terms, with other countries, including the United States and France, saying they'll step in to provide additional resources and military assistance in order to facilitate that process. But while how strictly the terms are enforced will probably shape how bad the overall situation is for Hezbollah, almost however it plays out, it's hard to argue the group isn't in a much worse position than it was at the beginning of 2024. It's militarily weaker, having lost fighters, leaders, infrastructure and munition stockpiles. Its leadership cadre has been devastated, and it's lost many of its previously forward-positioned assets. One Lebanese official reportedly described Hezbollah as an organisation that now needs time to tend its wounds. Reuters, citing sources familiar with Hezbollah operations, said, quote, Hezbollah believes the number of fighters killed during 14 months of hostilities could reach several thousand, with the vast majority killed since Israel went on the offensive in September. That said, publicly, Hezbollah says they won, with Naim Qassem claiming publicly that the organisation had scored a quote-unquote divine victory, and that, quote, we won because we prevented the enemy from destroying Hezbollah and annihilating or weakening the resistance, end quote. Although arguably, as far as definitions of victory go, not being completely destroyed by your opponent is probably kind of like your mate Damo arguing that he had a great 2024 because he only went to prison twice. Sure, you're technically clearing a bar there, but you're not exactly going to set any strategic high jump records doing so. However you characterise the strategic outcomes, basically everyone, including Hezbollah figures themselves, agreed that after the fighting, the organisation would need to rebuild its resources. Something the peace treaty was explicitly meant to prevent by putting greater controls on the sale of weapons and military equipment into Lebanon. As analysts were quick to point out though, Hezbollah did have a workaround in place for those kind of international arms restrictions. To quote from the Reuters article on the right there, analysts say one of the major challenges in enforcing this faceted deal will be the decades-old smuggling industry that operates in the border region between Lebanon and Syria, where the government of President Bashar al-Assad has long turned a blind eye to, if not actively supported, the transfer of weapons supplies that Israel says often originate in Iran, end quote. So basically, Hezbollah was probably still in a decent position to rearm itself using Iranian supplies over time, as long as nothing happened to Assad's government in Syria. And of course, as we now know, something was about to happen to Assad's government in Syria, namely less than 2 weeks of special military operation, causing the regime to suffer critical existence failure. A brief observation about how that collapse played out, however, is that previously the Syrian regime had often called on Hezbollah fighters to play a significant ground combat role. This time, however, when Assad's government arguably needed it the most, it doesn't appear Hezbollah was able to provide the same support it has previously, possibly due to a combination of it losing so many of its resources in the fight against Israel and its efforts to send reinforcements being interdicted by the Israeli Air Force. If that's the case, then arguably this is a situation where Hezbollah now lacked the strength to protect its ally, and without that ally, it may now find it much harder to reconstitute its strength. The only reason that Assad and Syria go second here, compared to Nasrallah and Hezbollah, is that Assad actually survived the process. We now know he made it to Moscow, although officially he claims that was basically by accident. According to a statement by Assad, quote, "At no point during the events did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge, nor was such a proposal made by any individual or party," end quote. Instead, what he claims happened is that he went to the Russian military base in Latakia province to oversee combat operations, as he put it, only to discover that Syrian troops had abandoned their positions and the airbase was now under intensified drone strikes. Given those claimed drone strikes, quote, "With no viable means of leaving the base, Moscow requested that the base command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the evening of Sunday 8th December, end quote. So basically, as he tells it, he never intended to abandon Syria, he just abandoned the capital for a Russian military base, and then once he got there, the Russians basically forced him to fly to Moscow because it would be too dangerous to go out the front gate again. Whatever the case though, after Assad's family had ruled Syria for more than half a century, he definitively and suddenly lost his seat of power, and time will now tell if he loses anything else while in exile. But whatever the case, assessing the strategic delta here is relatively simple. At the beginning of 2024, Assad had a country. At the end of it, he had a Moscow apartment. The last member of the Axis I want to look at, however, is arguably in better shape than the others. Despite being matched up against the likes of the US and allied navies as their opponent, kind of a massive contrast in terms of technology and capability compared to the often Toyota-born rebels that Assad had to deal with, at time of recording, the Houthis in Yemen are still very much in the fight, while Assad is in Moscow. They were able to launch a long-range missile attack against Israel in late December and have repeatedly attempted to attack US and allied warships. In the latter respect, with one asterisk we'll cover in a moment, they've been mostly without success. But remember, the apparent operational goal of Houthi attacks against shipping in the Red Sea region isn't to destroy allied warships or single-handedly defeat the US Navy. It's to disrupt global shipping by problematizing transit through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And in that respect, they've arguably been fairly successful. Despite Operation Prosperity Guardian throwing everything up to and including nuclear-powered aircraft carriers at the problem, compared to the levels we saw before the Houthis began their campaign in 2023, the number and displacement of merchant ships travelling through the Red Sea and Suez Canal is still significantly down. And the flow-on effect of so much of that traffic having to divert away from the Red Sea route and take longer, more expensive options has been more expensive shipping more generally. Because when you take a longer route, you need more ships, all else being equal, to move the same amount of cargo. We've seen global shipping operate at, historically speaking, very low levels of slack capacity. And according to calculations by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which you can see charted on the right there, of the massive increase we saw from October 2023 onwards in the China Containerized Freight Index, which is basically a measurement of the average freight cost for containerized cargo departing China, the overwhelming majority traces back to the disruptions in the Red Sea, and thus the Houthis. Indeed, according to that chart, if not for the Houthi disruption in the Red Sea, between October 2023 and June 2024, shipping costs from China would actually have fallen, and with it, presumably, one source of pressure on inflation worldwide. It's especially notable, I think, that as we warned when we first talked about the crisis in the Red Sea, that because of their nature as a very dispersed, dug-in paramilitary force, despite a number of allied missile and airstrikes, we've continued to see the Houthis retain the technical ability and the will to launch attacks on civilian and military vessels. Back in November, for example, the Pentagon confirmed that the USS Spruance and USS Stockdale had been attacked by a mixture of 5 anti-ship ballistic missiles and 8 one-way attack drones. And while the Allied warships engaged in Prosperity Guardian have generally been able to defend themselves against the kind of threats the Houthis have been able to throw at them, that doesn't mean the operation has been without its costs. Not just in terms of the deployment costs of some very rare and in-demand assets and some very expensive interceptor missiles that now, along with a lot of the cruise missiles being used, obviously can't be allocated to US forces in other regions, like the Indo-Pacific. But also incidents like the USS Gettysburg reportedly shooting down a combat jet, namely a friendly FA-18 Hornet flying off the carrier Harry S. Truman. Obviously, the Houthis didn't directly inflict that loss, but the demands of the campaign against them arguably did. Assessing the year as a whole as a strategic victory or defeat then for the Houthis is somewhat complicated. On one hand, you could argue they largely succeeded and continued to succeed in one of their major operational goals, disrupting shipping in the Red Sea. But on the other hand, doing that doesn't appear to have been without cost. What they achieved in strategic terms is slightly more ambiguous. Their stated goal, for example, was largely to force Israel to abandon its operations in Gaza, something that didn't happen. And while the group is obviously still fighting and having a disruptive impact on global trade, doing so hasn't been without a cost in personnel and resources, both in terms of personnel and infrastructure destroyed in Allied air and missile strikes, and also the weapons expended in the attacks themselves. Turns out that, unless you're Tony Stark, it's kind of hard to build an anti-ship ballistic missile in a cave in Yemen, and so a lot of the weapons and funding necessary to sustain that effort have to come from somewhere else. Which brings us to the nexus of this particular axis, and I'd suggest one of 2024's biggest strategic losers, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, to be fair, Iran probably aren't nominees for the true wooden spoon on the strategic outcomes ladder. But given they had a couple of true contenders for that position on their ally list, like Assad, you can probably already see the outlines of a pretty tough year for Tehran. They lost one ally in Syria entirely, which incidentally also cut off their easiest land transportation route to resupply Hezbollah, which desperately needed resupply after being beaten up fairly severely over the course of 2024. And that's to say nothing of the current state of Hamas, which is a threat we'll pull on again in the future. They also lost their president in a helicopter crash in May, although the impact that had on the strategic balance in the region was probably secondary to the effects of the escalating conflict with Israel, with the standout moments being two major Iranian missile attacks against Israel and the associated Israeli actions. Analysts and later historians will probably be debating the effects of Iran's two missile strikes, True Promise in April and True Promise 2 in October, for some time. At this stage, we believe the April strikes used about 300 weapons, including cruise missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles, while the later October strike used fewer but higher capability weapons. In terms of human life lost, given the number of missiles fired, the number of casualties was mercifully small. The October strike, for example, is reported to have killed a grand total of 2 civilians. A number of Israeli air bases, especially Nevatim, received multiple hits. But as far as we can tell, no actual aircraft, including the valuable F-35s, were actually impacted. They appear to have been able to evacuate first. Instead, the damage appears to have been primarily limited to things like base infrastructure, like hangars. And so whether these attacks achieve their goals or not really comes down to your assessment of what Iran was hoping to achieve by doing them. If you believe the goal was simply to demonstrate that Iran could get a missile to a military target in Israel through Israeli missile defences some of the time, then it likely succeeded. Likewise, it clearly put a significant tax on Israel's missile defence system, forcing the expenditure of a lot of interceptor missiles. But it also involved Iran expending hundreds of its valuable longer-range precision missiles to do comparatively little damage. Meaning that as we go into 2025, instead of those missiles being in inventory to function as a deterrent or use against other regional targets or to barter to Russia in exchange for all kinds of military or economic assistance, they're now just expended missile wreckage spread across the Middle East. I'll leave it to the audience to decide how you assess the net strategic effect there. But I think in order to get a more complete sense of the impact of both of these strikes, you also need to take account of the Israeli response. Israel appears to have adopted the same broad type of response against both Operation True Promise and its October sequel. Airstrikes leveraging the F-35 and long-range munitions to launch precision attacks against targets in Iran itself. We talked about the smaller April airstrikes in the past, but we've heard more about the October one since. In a lecture to RUSI, published on the 4th of December, the UK Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, made a somewhat brief comment about the Israeli action. Quote, "I won't go into detail, but in October's retaliatory strikes against Iran, Israel used more than 100 aircraft carrying fewer than 100 munitions, with no aircraft getting within 100 miles of the target in the first wave, and that took down nearly the entirety of Iran's air defence system. It has destroyed Iran's ability to produce ballistic missiles for a year and left Tehran with a strategic dilemma as to how it responds." End quote. Interestingly, he also noted that while there were multiple waves in the attack, it was delivered in a single sortie, meaning it sounds like more than 100 aircraft went up at the same time, and that force was then able to use fewer than 100 munitions in order to carry out a CAD attack on the Iranian air defence system, as well as do significant damage to a critical area of Iranian defence industrial production, ballistic missile output. And that's alongside other sensitive sites also believed to have been hit, including what some American sources suggest was an active nuclear research site. This choice of target was a very interesting one from an escalation management perspective. Obviously, striking nuclear facilities is a major step with significant potential for international blowback. And some reports citing US officials indicate that the US actually asked the Israelis to refrain from targeting any Iranian nuclear facilities. But officially, according to Iran, this site had been inactive for some time, which presumably put Tehran in a rather difficult position. In order to accuse the Israelis of striking an active nuclear facility, they would have had to say that this was an active nuclear facility and they'd been lying about it. Instead, for the most part, they appear to have chosen to be very, very quiet about it, leaving the actual status of the facility and what the Israelis knew about it as an open question. And my core point here is that once you start to factor in some of the damage that may have been done in these Israeli airstrikes, the net impact on Iran's power and position arguably becomes a little clearer. Trading hundreds of long-range weapons for Israeli interceptor missiles and some airbase infrastructure is one thing, but trading hundreds of weapons as well as your ballistic missile production capacity, significant chunks of your imported air defense system, and possibly a secret nuclear research facility, again, for those same hangars in the Israeli desert, probably isn't the greatest trade deal in the history of trade deals, unless you happen to be one of Iran's major competitors watching this all play out. And while that arguably touches on the more military and geostrategic side of all of this, the evolution in the Iranian economic position over the course of 2024 can probably be summarised in a single sentence, very familiar to those of you who read a lot of Slavic history. And then it got worse. The Iranian economy was still generally predicted to grow in 2024, although the slowdown in that rate of growth was the most dramatic of any of the BRICS nations. Inflation remained above a casual 30% and isn't generally expected to fall that much in 2025. And then to top it all off in December, we saw sudden and dramatic blackouts. As the temperatures in some places fell below 0 degrees C, tens of millions of Iranians had to grapple with the lights going out. As one piece by the Atlantic Council highlights, quote, Iran's gas and energy plants are rusted and outdated, operating at only 70% capacity, end quote. But in the case of the December outages, the core problem appears to not have been that the ballistic missile program was rated as a more important use of resources than modernising the energy infrastructure, but instead that one of the most energy resource-rich countries in the world didn't have fuel for its power plants, with the energy minister reportedly saying at the time that 13 power plants were out of commission due to a lack of fuel. Quote, if the fuel is provided, there will be no problem in providing the electricity, as power plants have undergone necessary repairs and are ready for the winter. The Petroleum Ministry is following up on providing fuel, end quote. On one hand, this may primarily just be a sign of issues in the Iranian economy, government, and resource allocation system itself. It's reported, for example, that even though Iran at the best of times operates with an energy shortage, the country still has to export electricity, reportedly in part because, quote, domestic energy prices are so tightly controlled that even the state-owned energy company is forced to sell electricity abroad at higher rates to stay afloat, end quote. In other words, the Iranian government has taken a good that the country has a shortage of, electricity, and then made it so cheap that companies need to export the good in order to not go bankrupt, all while presumably incentivising the domestic economy to leave the lights on as much as they want because the power price is so low. But while it's still very much in the hearsay category, I thought I'd mention one theory that there might be a nexus between these recent blackouts and Iran's foreign policy adventures. One of the core claims of a recent New York Times article was that Israeli actions much earlier in 2024 actually knocked out some critical Iranian pipelines, which prompted Iranian authorities to begin tapping emergency reserves, meaning that when shit started to get real in December, the reserves weren't there to cover it. Again, I'm not sure how I'd evaluate the reliability of that particular claim, but I think it does serve to illustrate the kind of way that foreign and military policy can have direct interplay with domestic economic policy. And as recently as a week ago at time of recording, it was reported that about half the country's industrial parks were still offline. And I'd argue the real cherry on top for Iran is there probably isn't much reason to be optimistic about things getting better in 2025 either. Historically, Trump has very much been an Iran hawk. He was the one that pulled the US out of the nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, and also made the decision to assassinate Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. So there might be reasons for Tehran to be somewhat nervous about the way US foreign policy in the region is about to change on the 20th of January. Oh, and somehow Tehran manages to find itself in the enviable position of having terrible relationships both with Washington DC and the Taliban, with future potential flashpoints including deep disagreements over dams and water supply. So if we were to summarise the overall strategic shift for the axis of resistance in 2024, it would go something like this. Militarily, they lost the Syrian Arab Army and, more importantly, its thousands of armoured vehicles and aircraft completely, with many of those now actually being in the hands of their strategic opponents. Hezbollah was significantly degraded, the Houthis expended significant resources, and the Iranians themselves fired off a significant portion of their long-range missile reserves, while also apparently losing significant parts of their air defence system and perhaps ballistic missile production capacity in return. Geopolitically, one member of the Axis was lost entirely. Another has signed a peace agreement which pledges to push it back from the positions it held at the start of the year. And economically, Iran itself is looking comparatively shaky at exactly the time when its proxies and allies probably need more support than ever to help rebuild, and a second Donald Trump administration is about to move into the White House. You could potentially argue that all of this comes with some countervailing strategic benefits, like suspending any hopes of rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the short term. But even then, you could argue a lot of those benefits didn't accrue in 2024, but back in 2023, while most of what continued to flow in 2024 was just the associated costs. Expressed another way, if you're a bloke at the Pentagon or Langley whose job was to undermine Iranian strategic interests, then you probably absolutely smashed all of your performance targets in 2024 and might well be up for a commendation. Provided, of course, no one asked how much of what happened was actually the result of US action. Now, of course, geopolitics is often, but not always, a zero-sum game. And so if the contention is the Axis had a pretty bad year, who might some of the major regional beneficiaries be? A classic answer, albeit one that now comes with an asterisk, would probably be Saudi Arabia. There, things are complicated because they had long opposed the Houthis, Assad, and Iranian influence in the region in general, although we had started to see a bit of détente in 2023. Before the beginning of 2024, Assad had actually been readmitted into the Arab League. It's arguable, however, that none of that really means the Saudis can't be beneficiaries of the way things played out. Syria's new foreign minister, for example, recently announced that his first overseas trip would be to Saudi Arabia. And while Saudi Arabia and Iran have been pursuing cautious rapprochement, as the article on the right describes it, that doesn't make them the best of friends. And perhaps most importantly from Riyadh's perspective, a weaker Iranian position in the region might give them greater leverage in any negotiations that take place. Arguably not a bad deal, given the kingdom didn't exactly have to expend a lot of resources or take point on making all this happen. They've mostly outsourced the task of fighting the Houthis to the Americans and their allies, the Iranians to the Israelis, and the Syrians to other Syrians. The Kingdom of Jordan may also be in the position to be a beneficiary, depending on how things play out in Syria and the wider region, with the key highlight being that this is a country that had considered the Captagon trade coming out of Assad Syria to be such a national security threat that it actually resorted to launching airstrikes on a number of occasions. In that respect, you can probably count any country in the region that was suffering disproportionately from the Captagon trade as a nervous winner from the whole thing, given that since the change of management in Syria, we've seen a lot of evidence coming out that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has been dismantling and destroying a lot of the production and distribution infrastructure. The main concerns now, though, are probably A, whether that effort will be sustained, and B, whether production and distribution efforts will now simply shift elsewhere. But almost whatever happens with the Captagon trade, if you were to identify one country, often flagged in the media as a major winner out of the fall of the Assad government in Syria and the general shift in the power dynamics of the region, it'd have to be Turkey. To summarise, the official Turkish stance is that there is a new reality now in Syria, and it has absolutely nothing to do with them. As the foreign minister put it, quote, "It would be a mistake at this time to try and explain the events in Syria by any foreign interference," end quote. But it sure does feel that from the Black Sea to Syria, many of Turkey's strategic competitors had a very rough 2024. Although I think the overall picture for Erdogan and Turkey is arguably a bit more mixed. Geopolitically, the country's been racking up wins. Assad has gone in Syria, and Turkish influence is likely to grow there. While in the Black Sea, Russia's difficulties have been arguably shifting the balance of power in Turkey's favour. And with the shutdown of transit for Russian gas through Ukraine, Turkey is now positioning itself as an ever more important gas transit hub. The strategic balancing factor, however, is probably just economics. According to the Turkish Statistical Institute, the country's economy, which was already only growing at a relatively slow pace, actually went through a quarter-on-quarter contraction between July and September. That puts the country in the unenviable position of having slow or negative economic growth, high interest rates, and high inflation. We've talked in the past about the challenge that Russia's official interest rates, around 21%, pose to many in the Russian economy, and the prediction that if the Russian economy isn't appropriately managed, it may find itself trapped in a cycle of stagflation, with minimal growth, high interest rates, and double-digit inflation. The Turks, however, are arguably already there. Admittedly, the official interest rate in Turkey isn't 21%, it's 47.5%. And inflation in December was lower on a year-on-year basis than expected, at 44%. In other words, inflation is going in the right direction, but there's still a very long way to go. So as we close out our look at this region, I think a fair characterisation of Turkey's performance in 2024 would generally be one of successes abroad, matched against ongoing difficulties at home. And so with our time in the Middle East at an end for now, let's jump over to the Americas. Because it's time, I think, to check in on Venezuela. You'll probably remember that the Bolivarian Republic made it onto the channel at the absolute tail end of 2023, after President Maduro staged a Putin-style referendum on the annexation of the oil-rich region of Essequibo in neighbouring Guyana. At the time, we went through a couple of potential strategic motivations for that particular move. One possibility, which we assessed as a far outside chance, was that Maduro actually intended to invade Guyana, annex Essequibo, and gain control of its oil-rich regions, which were primarily offshore. Other, perhaps more grounded potential objectives included chilling potential foreign investment in the Essequibo region, forcing Guyana to make concessions to Venezuela over its oil resources, and/or exploiting a rally around the flag effect in Venezuela itself in order to win popular support ahead of the 2024 Venezuelan elections. So let's quickly go through some of those potential objectives and assess how Venezuela did. Militarily, taking over Essequibo, or Guyana as a whole, which remember has a population of only around 830,000 people, obviously didn't happen. Despite some initial fears, there was ultimately no Venezuelan special military operation. And just as 2024 was coming to a close, and with significant international pressure, Guyana and Venezuela both promised that they wouldn't use force to resolve the dispute over Essequibo, which, given the massive military disparity between the two sides, was arguably a very one-sided agreement. Diplomatically, that probably closed the door to any Venezuelan military options in the short term at least. And perhaps worse, from Maduro's perspective, if there ever was the prospect of such an operation succeeding, the window might be closing. Because off the back of increased oil revenues and a lot of diplomatic proactivity, Guyana's been going about strengthening its defence forces and racking up international agreements. 2024 saw the delivery of new military equipment from a range of countries, including India and France, and the signing of a new security cooperation agreement with Paris. The US and Guyana carried out multiple joint exercises, and Venezuela got particularly agitated on the news that Guyana would be purchasing a new patrol vessel from France to complement two smaller ones from the United States, insisting that, despite the French vessel not having a main armament, quote, the false victim Guyana buys an ocean patrol vessel from a French company. Guyana, together with the United States, its Western partners, and its former colonial master, constitute a threat to the peace of our region, end quote. Arguably continuing a long-running international tradition of larger, more militarily powerful nations, describing the acquisition of even limited defensive capabilities by smaller nations as provocations or destabilising. Broadly speaking, Guyana's strategy through 2024 appears to have been to start building up their military capability as oil resources become available, while also winning as many international friends as possible, a move which saw some very public success in November when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a 3-day trip to the nation, the first by an Indian Prime Minister since Indira Gandhi in the 1960s, and publicly declared his expectation that Guyana would play a big role in India's energy security. And that statement, I think, leads us pretty well into potential Venezuelan objective number 2, encouraging international players not to invest in Guyana and strengthening Venezuela's hand at the negotiating table. And in that respect, Venezuela's efforts arguably succeeded in doing basically nothing to arrest the massive growth in Guyana's oil output. At the start of 2019, Guyana produced basically no oil. By the end of 2023, that number had increased to around 400,000 barrels a day. Now, it's above the 600,000 mark and predicted to jump more than 200,000 additional barrels per day over the course of 2025. As of December 2024, Guyana is now behind only Kuwait and Qatar in per capita oil output, and international investment is absolutely still flowing, with ExxonMobil announcing plans during 2024 to drill up to 30 additional oil wells for its 7th project in Guyana. The expectation, according to ExxonMobil's website, is that, quote, production capacity in Guyana is expected to surpass 1.7 million barrels per day, with gross production growing to 1.3 million barrels per day by 2030, end quote. And so if Venezuela did intend to put pressure on Guyana's hydrocarbon development, a projected more than tripling of output over the course of 6 years probably doesn't count as a medal-winning performance, unless, of course, the medal's coming from Guyana or the many countries around the world that are deeply invested in getting more non-OPEC oil on the market. And even if the goal of Maduro's referendum and posturing was simply for domestic political purposes, it doesn't really appear that worked either. In the middle of 2024, Venezuela's elections went ahead. Maduro's government claimed to have won with a narrow majority of the vote, but the opposition claimed the results were fraudulent. Now, I want to be very clear here, don't rig elections. But if elections are being rigged, historically there are a couple of different models we've seen governments use. One option is to take the North Korea or Comrade Tito approach and just wave it in everyone's faces, claim you won 99% of the vote, presumably wink at the camera and call it a day. Another macro option, however, is to try and make it look credible, which generally means going through the motions of having an electoral process, having ballots cast, and then claiming to have won a majority, but preferably a believable majority. Maduro, in this case, it's claimed went with the latter option, claiming to have won about 51% of the vote. The problem with holding the entire sham process, though, was that there were actual voters casting actual ballots through a process that, in many cases, the opposition were at least somewhat able to observe, and in this case, they managed to get most of the receipts, collecting by hand through a massive network of poll watchers tally sheets from voting machines across the country. They don't appear to have gotten all of them, but reportedly they did get the vast majority. And that was enough to demonstrate to most around the world the most likely result here was that Maduro had lost the election and lost badly. That obviously wasn't enough to stop him from simply claiming victory and hanging on regardless, but it does appear to indicate that the Essequibo gambit probably didn't win him the kind of support that he might have hoped. And that's without going too far into the country's ongoing geopolitical and economic challenges. For many years, especially under Chavez, one of Venezuela's primary international backers and arms suppliers had been the Russian Federation. But especially since 2022, Russia has been increasingly indisposed. Its resources are more widely stretched, and it's perhaps not in the same position it once was to provide military and economic assistance. And economically, Venezuela could very much do with ongoing assistance. According to the IMF, in purchasing power parity terms, the Venezuelan economy did grow slightly over the course of 2024, but it remains less than half the size it was in 2015, smaller than it was in 1995, and the projected increase in consumer prices in 2025, according to the IMF estimates, is set to be a casual 59.6%, which obviously puts the country in a fantastic position to stoke future geopolitical crises against a neighbouring country that's apparently been treating international diplomacy like a game of bloody Pokemon and trying to catch them all when it comes to international nuclear power friends and allies. You could also argue that Venezuela's position has had at least some flow-on effects to another country in the Americas that I want to give a quick honourable mention for having a 2024 they'd probably sooner rather forget: Cuba. Economically, we've seen the country face energy problems, even worse than those that we described in Iran. Reportedly, this was a result of multiple issues compounding together. The generation infrastructure was described as, quote, obsolete and crumbling, with 80% of generation capacity relying on oil products, the primary source for which had been Venezuela, which, as you can probably imagine, wasn't able to be the most reliable or generous provider through 2024. In October, it was reported that the national power grid had collapsed 4 times in as many days. The island's largest power plant had temporarily gone offline, and with Venezuelan supplies uncertain and the government lacking the foreign exchange necessary to buy everything it might want on the spot market, as the article on the right put it, quote, power cuts of up to 20 hours a day are now common, end quote, while it also noted that the Cuban energy minister had said that even when the system came back online, Cubans shouldn't expect an end to blackouts. The power outages were arguably just one very visible symptom in 2024 of a longer-running and broader economic and demographic trend. In January, reports were describing a country grappling with inflation and a national budget deficit expected to exceed 18% of GDP. As it was officially, inflation in the country was about 27% by November 2024. The Cuban government itself claimed that progress was being made, but that it was too slow, with the economy minister reportedly saying, quote, the government plan to correct distortions and revive the economy is a process that is advancing, but not at the speed we want, end quote. While the government also suggests that about 10% of the Cuban population were without running water. Economic troubles may also have helped inform continued demographic outflows. Estimates of just how many people have left Cuba vary by source. But even at the absolute low end, the Cuban government's official statistics agency suggests that the population has fallen by about 10% since 2020, while other estimates are significantly higher. In a major challenge for the Cuban economy, most of those leaving appear to be young and able-bodied workers, most of whom go to the United States. And again, according to Cuban government statistics, 1 in 4 Cubans is now believed to be over the age of 60. This process arguably makes it even harder for Cuba to revitalise its economy, which in turn provides additional incentive for those that can leave to leave. And with Trump's first term in office having included new US sanctions being placed on Cuba, his re-election in November may have raised the risks for Cuba even further going forward. And so with that brief but important aside, I think it's now time to leave the Americas and pivot over to the Korean Peninsula. And so I'm not sure if I'm going to throw anyone off with this next pick, but in the column of winners but with risks, I'm going to put the DPRK. And I can absolutely already hear some of the objections saying, Perun, North Korea is in a terrible economic and strategic position. What are they doing on this list? But in a sense, that's kind of the point. We're measuring how the strategic position of a country changed over the course of 2024, not whether it's good or bad, full stop. And so the fact North Korea started the year at a very, 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 very low point in some ways actually makes it easier for them to make it onto the podium. If you want to get an idea of how bad things were at the start of the year, keep in mind that Kim Jong-un himself, at a party meeting, described the economy as a serious political issue, openly suggesting that the government was unable at present to provide even basic necessities such as foodstuffs, groceries, and consumer goods to its people. Now, if you're a foreign economic analyst, including in one of North Korea's allied countries, your response to that statement is probably that water is also wet and the sky is also blue. But in a country where leaders are semi-deified, propaganda is intense, and the military is supposedly powerful enough to destroy the United States and its allies if the leader ever gives the order, things probably have to be pretty double plus ungood before you get statements like this one. And so your next question might be, how much better did the situation get here over the course of 2024 then? And here, I think it really matters how you're looking at things. Are you coming at it through the lens of the ordinary North Korean people, their standard of living or status of living full stop, or from the point of view of the North Korean government and its strategic outlook? Because the North Korean population, I'd argue, probably had a pretty bad year, impacted by a range of economic factors that made already difficult life even more so. A key starting point here, and a common theme across a lot of the countries we'll look at in the loser column, is a steep devaluation in the national currency. In terms of currency structure, the North Korean economy is a bit of a strange one. Officially, there's only one currency in circulation, the North Korean won. But especially in the 2010s, before a crackdown beginning roughly 2019, you saw a lot of foreign currency in circulation as well, primarily Chinese and American. One source supposedly quoting from a leaked North Korean document said the government had issued instructions, quote, for a thorough eradication of the phenomenon of buying and saving more foreign currency than one needs on the basis of unfounded rumours that the exchange rate will continue to rise, while also separately stressing that, quote, all workplaces and citizens unconditionally adhere to the official exchange rate of 8,900 North Korean won to the dollar when distributing cash, end quote. All that to say that exchange rates in North Korea are funky, especially when it gets to reporting on the real, unofficial or black market rate, whatever you want to call it. But reportedly that unofficial rate started to fall off a cliff sometime around July. And it may have gone into shaping some quite painful results for ordinary North Koreans. What you're looking at on screen here is one report on the price of rice in the city of Pyongyang over the course of 2024. From less than 5,000 won a kilogram in January, the price spiked to nearly 9,000 in the data for December. Now, there is almost no economic context where people are not going to notice food price inflation. It's kind of an unavoidable expense. But the poorer the country you're in, the more of your income is likely to be spent on food, and therefore the more punishing food price inflation is. And in that respect, 2024 has been a year of pain for a lot of people in North Korea. And that's from a baseline that was already so low, it may as well be in the basement. The United Nations 2023 report on global food security estimated that between 2020 and 2022, about 12 million North Koreans, or about 45.5% of the population, were undernourished. North Korea's own official figures suggest that the production of things like meat and eggs, for example, might have peaked in the late 1970s. But from the point of view of the government in Pyongyang, 2024 did offer some opportunities to offset the country's difficulties. And that list basically begins and ends with the results of an agreement signed with the Russian Federation, which has seen expanding military, economic, and technical cooperation, with perhaps one of the biggest benefits to talk about right up front being that it has given North Korea something valuable to trade. You can't generally go very far on the international markets if your primary exports include cybercrime and nuclear threats. But what North Korea does have is a very large, if comparatively low-tech military industry and lots of soldiers. Soldiers that, thanks to conscription and very low qualities of life during service, are basically free from the government's perspective. The evidence is pretty compelling at this point that North Korean military assistance to Russia massively expanded over the course of 2024. One article in the Times, citing everyone's favourite source, the anonymous Western intelligence officials, indicated that as of late 2024, about half of all Russian artillery projectiles used in Ukraine are from North Korea. And more video and other evidence is coming out to support the assertion that thousands of North Korean troops probably have been deployed to Russia, used in combat, with many of them becoming casualties. One of the most confronting elements for me going through a lot of the footage, ostensibly of North Korean troops in Russian service, is just how few of them appear to have been given enough supply priority to receive winter uniforms. To me, that suggests either severe logistical difficulties or a priority decision, basically saying that these troops aren't worth the effort it would take to give them something white to wear. What they do appear to be worth, though, is oil, as well as a range of other goods and services. To quote from the article on the right, Russia is estimated to have supplied North Korea with more than 1 million barrels of oil since March this year, according to satellite imagery analysis from the Open Source Center. It notes that the satellite images show more than a dozen different North Korean oil tankers arriving at a Russian oil terminal in the Far East, a total of 43 times over a period of 8 months. It should be noted that per UN resolutions, the amount of barrels of refined petroleum North Korea can receive annually is capped at 500,000, meaning these Russian shipments alone would be twice the total annual limit. Pyongyang is also believed to be receiving various military assistance from Russia, including air-to-air missiles and air defense systems, technical assistance with some of its domestic weapon systems projects. Some reports suggest, for instance, that Russian engineers worked with the North Koreans to upgrade the KN-25 Super Heavy multiple rocket launcher, equipping them, it's claimed, with new guidance and control systems. This is particularly valuable for the North Koreans because they're meant to be cut off from this kind of military technical assistance. It's also reported the North Korean Air Force might become a beneficiary of some of these kinds of arrangements, with Russia bartering older fighter jets to the country in exchange for North Korean assistance. The North Korean Navy has also released images suggesting it's in the process of building its largest ever domestic surface warship, one which appears to make provision for features we've never seen on another North Korean vessel, like a vertical launch system. That could be a case of North Korea finally catching up with some late Cold War technology, or it could point to another case where Russian assistance might be useful. The big unknown here, and perhaps the most valuable potential prize for North Korea from a military technical perspective, would be Russian assistance with its missile program. And for a North Korean military constantly pushing to improve its nuclear weapon delivery options against nations further and further afield, even catching up to where the Soviet Union was in the mid-late Cold War era would be a significant improvement, and a major concern for many of the surrounding countries. And from the North Korean perspective, one potential advantage of this kind of arrangement is they don't really face much in the way of sanctions blowback risk. Just about everything North Korea does, and everyone in the North Korean political elite, are already covered by international sanctions. And arguably over 2024, what we actually saw wasn't an intensification of sanctions on North Korea, but the sanction system starting to break down. For example, the United Nations used to have a panel of experts which monitored member states to check that they were following UN sanctions on North Korea. Since May 2024, though, it doesn't, after Russia vetoed the annual resolution renewing the panel's mandate. That means that thanks to Russia, there are still technically United Nations sanctions on North Korea, just no panel responsible for checking whether countries are actually following those rules. As ironic as it seems, one mechanism North Korea might be using to break down its sanctions regime is by publicly associating with another very heavily sanctioned regime in order to trade for something that very few other countries can offer: a veto at the UN Security Council. Finally, we absolutely need to mention another arguable geopolitical win for North Korea that played out just to the south. In one of 2024's great public brain snap moments, early this year South Korea's president went on TV and announced suddenly that he was declaring martial law, which, to make a serious understatement, came a little bit out of left field from the point of view of the South Korean population, and which on its face wasn't super compatible with the whole democracy thing, given that, there wasn't actually a war or emergency on. As an outsider looking in, it's arguable that the way things ultimately played out, through all the chaos, probably did demonstrate some silver linings if you're trying to assess the health of South Korean democracy. Many in the military, for example, especially in more junior level, appear to have acknowledged the president's decision to declare martial law. However, given that pretty much everyone involved seems to have agreed it was a stupid-ass decision, much of the military appears to have fallen back on an old international soldierly tradition for troops when they're given stupid or dubious orders. They half-assed the shit out of it. They deployed basically none of the violence you'd actually need to make something like this work, and didn't prevent MPs from making it back inside the National Assembly. When you get reports that military assault teams were prevented from entering parts of the National Assembly building by staffers spraying fire extinguishers at them, you probably have to conclude that their hearts weren't exactly in it. Within a matter of hours, the National Assembly met. Those present voted unanimously to rescind the whole martial law thing, leading to, oversimplify, martial law eventually being rescinded and everyone going home, with the vast majority of the public applauding the end of the very short martial law period. And for his particularly bizarre manoeuvre, the president was later impeached and is now the subject of an arrest warrant. Basically, the president said, "I'm doing a coup," everyone said no, and they followed the appropriate legal steps to undo everything that he had done. From a South Korean perspective, certainly not the worst way it could have ended. But from a North Korean perspective, this was probably still an epic win. From a propaganda perspective, any chaos in the South or Japan or the United States is always going to be a boon. Further, as deeply unpopular as he was, President Yoon was generally considered to be quite hawkish on North Korea. There is absolutely no guarantee that his replacement will be the same. And indeed, the fact that he tried to justify his declaration of martial law by claiming that others were conspiring with North Korea may in the future poison the well against any accusations or claims that North Korea actually is attempting to influence South Korean politics. But as I flagged at the start, I think all of that in North Korea's case comes with an asterisk. Namely that in this high-stakes political game they're playing, there are a couple of risks emerging. Number one is how Beijing might choose to respond to all of Pyongyang's initiatives. While Russia can obviously supply North Korea with some of what it needs, Beijing is still overwhelmingly the country's most important trade partner and most critical benefactor. And so far, the PRC's public attitude towards this much closer relationship between North Korea and Russia and the deployment of North Korean troops to fight against the Ukrainian military has mostly been stony silence. As a former CIA Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific put it, quote, "The radio silence in Beijing on this subject is staggering. There's not a word in the Chinese press, either about the strategic agreement made between Russia and North Korea in the summer, or about sending troops," end quote. And while we obviously don't know the reality of the situation, it's interesting to note that the American perspective on the whole issue is that one contributing factor in Beijing's silence might just be awareness. Speaking of interactions with Beijing, the US Deputy Secretary of State reportedly recently said the following, quote, "In some of the discussions we've had, it seems we are informing them of things they were unaware of with regards to DPRK pursuits, and they are concerned that Russian encouragement might lead the DPRK to contemplate either actions or military actions that might not be in China's interests. China has not weighed in directly to criticise Russia, but we do believe the increasing coordination between Pyongyang and Moscow is unnerving them. Ultimately, we don't know what stance the PRC will take on North Korean-Russian cooperation in 2025. But if they do decide to pressurise North Korea to dial it back a bit, it's not entirely clear how Russia could ever hope to rapidly substitute the massive economic role that China plays in the North Korean economy. Risk 2 is what happens to North Korea if the music suddenly stops. Arguably at the core of North Korea's new relationship with Moscow are the massive demands of the war in Ukraine. If that conflict ends or freezes though, and especially if the sanctions regime is broken down, that basic calculus probably changes. And so North Korea might find itself facing the threat of having put other actors, like Beijing or Washington DC, even further offside by dealing with the Russians as it has, only for the Russians to later find themselves in the position to pull a bit of a veto manoeuvre and declare that they're altering the deal, and that Pyongyang can pray they don't alter it further. So from a strategic perspective, which is very different from the outlook of those actually living there, North Korea probably had a pretty decent 2024. Their primary local competitor destabilised, and they found a new ally willing to buy the resources they had in exchange for things that they needed: fuel, technology, and a jackhammer to take to the international sanction system. The wildcard factor going to 2025, though, is going to be risk, with everything from Beijing's policy to Russia's requirements and the outlook of the incoming Trump administration still very much up in the air. And with it, the DPRK's future strategic trajectory, which finally brings us to Europe, who do get to come last today because of how often the region comes up when we're discussing Russia and Ukraine. Straight up front, it's tempting to jokingly award the Kingdom of Denmark an It's Complicated award. On one hand, because in economic and strategic terms, a lot of things have been going relatively well for the country, in part because of the quite literally economy-distorting impacts of the success of medications like Ozempic, produced by a Danish company, which reportedly accounted for about 1 in every 5 Danish jobs created in 2023. The value, especially of the North American weight loss market, is apparently so large that it's enough to dominate an entire country's labour market. On the other hand, Trump also said he wanted Greenland. And while it is almost certain that the United States will not be invading a NATO ally in order to seize its territory, it's certainly different enough that I thought it deserved to get a mention here. So far as countries we actually talked about on the channel though, I want to give a win for 2024 to the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. In large part because back in March we finally saw Sweden officially join NATO, and with it, another major change in the alliance's strategic geography. Pre-2022, the Baltic states were arguably somewhat exposed out on the NATO eastern flank, partially encircled between Kaliningrad, Belarus and Russia proper, and mostly separated from NATO's primary bases and centres of gravity. With Finland and Sweden joining though, the neighbourhood now looks very different. with Russia now having to give much more consideration to its long border with Finland if it ever chooses to test Article 5, and a lot more alliance bases, forces and assets now in range to potentially respond quickly to any Baltic contingency. We also saw NATO states continue with their plans to beef up the alliance's military presence in the Baltic. During the year, for example, Germany stood up the Advanced Party and Activation Staff for what will eventually become a permanent, heavy German manoeuvre brigade stationed in Lithuania. Sure, that unit's only scheduled to officially start its deployment in 2025 and reach full operating capability by 2027, but by Bundeswehr standards, that's basically next-day delivery. While from July 2025, the UK is due to maintain a light brigade on standby, capable of rapid deployment to Estonia if required. That'll include pre-positioning British military stockpiles in Estonia. In terms of size, these forces are far from overwhelming, but from the perspective of planners in Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, there's still probably a lot of value here, because it signals to Moscow that any military operation against the Baltics would almost inevitably involve combat operations against troops from major NATO powers. We also saw an announcement right at the end of 2024, again arguably to the benefit of the Baltic states, that NATO would be looking to ramp up its military presence in the Baltic Sea, partly in response to hybrid threats, particularly sabotage operations against undersea cables, after a line connecting Estonia and Finland was damaged on the 25th of December. That threat has arguably always existed, so greater resources and efforts being directed against that threat is almost certainly in the interests of the Baltic states. But perhaps the greatest way the conventional military balance between the Baltic states and the Russian Federation changed over the course of 2024 was just as a result of Russian attrition in Ukraine. While NATO states have generally been, albeit slowly, increasing defence budgets, acquiring new defence equipment, and building up forces and infrastructure along the alliance's eastern and now northern flank, a lot of Russia's military resources have had to, out of necessity, been directed to Ukraine. And arguably, with every brigade the Ukrainians grind down, or every piece of Russian heavy equipment the Ukrainians destroy, the relative conventional threat to the Baltic states, all else being equal, probably shrinks by just that bit. One imagines if Moscow were ever to pick a major conventional fight with a NATO member state, it probably wouldn't be with golf carts, motorbikes, and assault shed conversions of the old T-62. And so you could probably argue that if Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia did get a win from a security and deterrence perspective in 2024, that probably owes a lot not just to the countries themselves or their NATO allies, but to Ukrainian endurance. Picking a winner, though, probably means we should also nominate a country we looked at that didn't have a great year. And out of the very limited number of European nations that have already received their own dedicated videos, I think there's a case to nominate France's 2024. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the French 2024 experience was on strategic par with some of the others we've looked at. Last I checked, for example, President Macron has not sought political asylum in Moscow or some other foreign capital. But over the course of 2024, France has had 4 prime ministers, a sluggish economy, stubborn government budget deficits, and strategically, an ongoing process of drawing down the country's forces and influence across Africa. This is a topic that will probably eventually get its own episode, so for now I'll keep it brief. But in July 2023, a coup d'etat overthrew the government in Niger. The former commander of the country's presidential guard declared himself the country's new leader, and the last French troops had reportedly left the country by the beginning of 2024, while the new regime reportedly began security cooperation with Moscow. In 2024, we didn't really see coups of the same kind, but the dominoes of French military presence in Africa nonetheless appear to have kept falling. Chad announced in December that the French military had handed over the first of its military bases in the country, as part of a withdrawal effort for the French contingent of roughly 1,000 personnel. Senegal's Prime Minister also announced in late December that the government would be closing all foreign military bases in the country, which sounds like a very general, non-targeted statement. But as you can imagine, the list of foreign states with military bases in the country pretty much begins and ends with France. And then there's Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, previously reportedly home to a French contingent of about 600 military personnel, that also announced that French forces would be leaving the country, with the president reportedly stating, quote, "We have decided in a concerted manner to withdraw French forces from the Ivory Coast," end quote. As I said, there's a wider story to tell here, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the security relationship between France and some of these countries is entirely at an end. If anything, I think it just demonstrates that we need a couple of episodes focused on Africa in 2025, because this is an incredibly large, diverse continent with a huge population that really deserves to be analysed with detail, nuance, and as more than just a domain for great power competition. But for now, I think it's fair to say that if we applied the same standards and rules as we have for other countries on this list, that between political and economic challenges at home and a diminishing strategic footprint abroad, then you can probably argue that in strategic terms, France didn't exactly stick the landing on 2024. Which brings us at last to our conclusion and a difficult question. Of the countries and actors we looked at today, who deserves the title of biggest strategic winner and greatest strategic loser of 2024? Obviously, this is going to be subjective, but if we are handing out a wooden spoon, I think there's a case to nominate Assad's Syria. In January 2024, Assad and his government had a country, a large military, a huge stockpile of military equipment, connections to a region-spanning Captagon empire, and, on paper, some major international allies. Come December 2024, they didn't. And for Bashar himself, you could argue that accidentally making it to Moscow was kind of a consolation prize. In our rankings today, we're really only counting things with strategic value. And in that respect, his regime managed to almost quite impressively lose basically everything in about 10 days. Meanwhile, if you're looking for strategic winners, I'm actually going to give a bit of an outsider's pick to Guyana, a nation of just over 800,000 people that started 2024 facing an international crisis and a much stronger opponent potentially posturing for an invasion or escalation, that managed to not just make it through the year, but arguably to thrive. IMF data puts recent real GDP growth, so inflation-adjusted GDP growth, at 62% in 2022, 33% in 2023, and 44% in 2024. And while the estimates for the next couple of years are much more humble, at between 14 and 21%, even those figures, by global standards, are still absolutely bloody insane. The country has been able to score diplomatic wins, sign additional agreements, attract additional investment, drawing on everything from the country's Commonwealth membership to interest in its oil reserves, in order to build up its international position. After all, if there's one area where the US has proven historical form, it's fighting curb-stomp wars against regional powers to defend small oil-rich nations in order to keep gas prices down, to defend democracy. And it's not just countries like France, the United Kingdom or the United States. Guyana has managed to attract investment from Chinese state-owned corporations and apparently insert themselves into India's energy strategy, and have slowly started to accumulate more domestic defence capability. The country obviously still isn't out of the woods. There'll be international legal battles to fight, ongoing security challenges, and all of the challenges that come with trying to manage a previously very poor nation that's suddenly endowed with immense resource wealth. But in 2024, most of the trends seem to be in the right direction, and the year ended with the announcement that just about every citizen of Guyana would be receiving a payment equivalent to about $480 as one small way of distributing the country's rising oil wealth. And so, because there is absolutely no reason that an Australian could possibly be biased in favour of a resource-rich country with some powerful regional neighbours, I'm going to nominate Guyana for a podium position on our list of strategic winners of 2024. Because while Assad's regime may have lost a country in 2024, Guyana and its people were building one. And okay, let me add on a channel update to close out. Originally, I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to do an end of 2024 video that was slightly more lighthearted than normal or much more lighthearted than normal. So, in the end, I ultimately decided to do both. You can thus probably think of last week's episode as the not-so-serious end of 2024, and this week as the slightly less serious beginning of 2025. At the same time, I did think there was value in zooming out and having a look at how things have played out for some of the states and actors that we looked at over the course of 2024 and the very tail end of 2023, and I hope you got something useful and enjoyable out of the episode. Starting next week, however, it's back to much more regular content as we kick off 2025 proper. In terms of broad plans for the year, I've already posted an update on Patreon, and there'll be more coming there, but the key points are that you should expect the regular Perun release schedule to remain consistent, while also seeing some smaller additional content drops for those on Patreon, and a resumption of Perun gaming content. The latter item there will probably kick off next week as we work to finish the X4 series, and then witness the return of the very much updated Terra Invicta. I very much hope that all of you had an enjoyable New Year's, wish you the very best for 2025, and with my thanks as always, I hope to see you all again next week.